Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Nova Scotia, Canada for the annual Halifax International Security Forum, an extraordinary conference that brings security leaders from all around the world here to this great town in the Maritimes of Canada. Our coverage here is sponsored by Boeing and Leonardo DRS, and it's our honor to be starting this conversation off with Daryl Bricker, the CEO of Ipsos, the global public affairs firm, who is a demographer at heart and also puts together the annual survey that goes with this. And folks should also check out his extraordinary book on global demography about an emptying world. Daryl, talk to us a little bit about the findings of this latest poll results. You're always looking at international security trends. You talked to 18,500 people in some 30 plus countries. Talk to us about what some of the key takeaways from your survey were.
Well, we seem to be in a disconcerted state in the world these days. The feeling of global threat has been rising over the space of the last year, and one of the really interesting things that we're seeing is that people are starting to change their views as to exactly which economy, which state system is really the most desirable one. And for the longest time, we've always thought it was liberal democratic capitalism. We always thought it was the United States that was the beacon of that. But now we see the reputation of China now rivaling the United States, which is a really interesting finding.
It is extraordinary that the United States is doing a little bit better this year than it did last in the wake of trade wars and statements by the president and sort of undermining global confidence in the American brand. But it's 52% for the United States, 53% for China, including a quarter of all Americans who think the Chinese system is actually, or even more than that. Talk to us a little bit about what some of these findings mean actually when you dig deeper into them.
Well, the easiest thing that you can look at is the change in leadership in the United States, and you can point to Donald Trump and his reputation in the rest of the world. That's part of the story. But there's another part of the story that's even more important, and that's people really looking at liberal democratic capitalism now as something to be challenged and questioned. And there's a couple of things that are really throwing that into some difficulty. And it's the fact, first of all, that people feel that capitalism isn't working for them. They feel that it's working on behalf of a global elite. They're not participating in whatever the benefits of economic growth are. The second thing that we're seeing is people not feeling that they're being represented in their own democratic system. So when they look at China, they can be critical of maybe what how their system operates, but it's not because their own system, say for example an American system or the Canadian system, is seen as operating at such an optimal level. There's a lot of questions right now about how to organize human society that we've thought for the last 30 years have been asked and answered. Now they're starting to be raised again.
And I thought it was interesting that, 40-some-odd% of Chinese want the American system, whereas 25% of Americans want the Chinese system?
Yeah, it's 44% of Americans, or 44% of the Chinese and 23% of Americans want to consider each other's systems. For Americans, China's still not aspirational, although for 1 in 4, maybe they're looking at their own system and saying, this isn't working for me, why not try something else? But still, there's, I would say, some prevalence around the idea that some aspects of the American system are really the most desirable in the world, particularly for the people who still live there.
How do you, as you look at the obviously, these trends are being manifest in the American political system. The Democratic race is populated by a lot of folks who are asking some of these questions about wealth inequality at the end of the day. And as we saw at the start of the forum, is always a great video to sort of put things into perspective. We have demonstrations and unrest all around the world. I know that you look at this from a global standpoint. Do you see, and a lot of security experts are sort of struggling with this sort of modern 1848 moment of sort of global revolution, or 1989 even. What do you attribute some of this to as you look at global trends?
Well, I think the two big things that you can really look at. Number one, whether or not capitalism is working on behalf of everybody. The growing sense around the world, regardless of whether you live in the United States, whether you live in Canada, whether you live in France, whether you live in Argentina or Brazil, is that it is not. That is, it's a system that's structured to benefit a specific elite, and the average person isn't benefiting from that. Now you can call that global inequality, as some people have said, or income inequality. I think we're talking about a bigger problem than just that. The priorities of capitalism seem to be now in question. The second thing is whether or not democracy, even if we aspire to what democracy should be, whether or not that system's actually working in the direction that your aspirations and expectations are. And the answer today is, even in countries like, for example, Canada, we have questions about whether or not democracy is working in the way that we feel it should be working. So what's happening in the world now is there are a lot of questions about these fundamental issues that since the end of the Second World War we pretty much thought have been resolved. They're now reemerging.
You have always in your writings always put some policy prognosis in there. What are some right ways that leaders around the world should be thinking about this at the end of the day? One of the important things about the Halifax conference is you're bringing a lot of very interdisciplinary people to think about big problems. We heard Peter in the introductory remarks talk about a strategy for dealing with China, for example, that hopefully the Halifax team and its participants can put together. What are some ways that leaders around the world have to think about this time and how to rethink almost everything about how we do things to get back to that democratic ideal that we all think is rather foundational to humanity?
Well, one of the things that I always find a bit confounding about what happens here in Halifax is that people seem to think that the conversation goes one way. So the grand and smart people who are here think that really this is about explaining to the public why they're either wrong or whether they don't understand or what they should really be paying attention to, rather than going in the other direction, which is listening a little bit and trying to understand that maybe some of these arguments that they're making back to the public are actually causing a different type of an effect. So maybe if there's anything that I could say is maybe we should listen a little bit more and try to understand what's at the root of these problems, which is why I bring it back to this conversation about Donald Trump. The easiest thing for anybody to say, or to populism, the easiest thing for anybody to say is to point to a couple of specific electoral events and say, there's the problem. No. These are actually the effects, not the causes. Trying to understand the causes by actually listening to what the public is saying, I think will give us a better sense of what those policy solutions need to be.
I think it's funny because I've got friends who voted for President Obama 2 times and then voted for Donald Trump because they voted for Obama for change, and they felt perhaps inaccurately not recognizing that Republicans were stymieing his entire agenda during his tenure. We're like, all right, well, let's try Donald Trump and give power to the Republicans so that and at the end of the day, they can drive change forward. And now they're very disappointed and looking to a Warren or other change figures to be like, okay, well, we gave one guy a shot, another guy a shot, let's go to the third one. Let me ask you about some other findings. You have rankings for how democracies are seen and how the United States and other nations are seen. How does that ranking stack up this year? What were sort of the major movements on that? Although I have to tell you, Canada generally tends to rank kind of high in that. I think Americans even look to Canada increasingly as sort of a voice for democracy. I think it's extraordinary that this conference gave the award to Hong Kong and the demonstrators there, even though China is a country that tends to punish anybody who does stuff like that. How does that national ranking stack up?
Well, the countries that are regarded the most highly in the world, when you ask about who do you want to see more of, who do you want to see more influence from, Canada's at the top of the list, and by the way, it tends to be at the top of the list over the last 10 years that we've been doing this survey. But you also see places like France, the UK, Germany. Countries in Western Europe tend to rank pretty high, along with some international institutions, for example, the United Nations. So there is credibility out there. The real question is whether or not that credibility among those countries and those organizations are properly marshaled to change the conversation and move it in a positive direction. That's what we're not necessarily seeing right now. Most of the attention, most of the oxygen in media conversation seems to be over these superpowers, whereas you have these other countries that people want to hear more from. So maybe it's up to the countries to step up a little bit and demand a little bit more airtime, because quite frankly, the public does want to hear from them.
And did the U.S. go up or down on your ranking this year?
It went slightly up, but it's still in the middle of the pack. At the bottom of the list, Israel, Saudi Arabia, and at the very bottom, Iran.
That certainly puts it all into perspective. Give us an update on your book, extraordinary piece of work, now in 8 languages. Give us an update.
Yeah, the book's called Empty Planet. I wrote it with John Ibbotson, and it's about what we call counterintuitive arguments. It's about vertical knowledge. It's about this idea that the thing that everybody knows, everybody quotes, every professor quotes, every academic quotes, every intellectual quotes, every government official quotes, that happens to be wrong. And the thing that they love to quote is that the global population is going to be over 11 billion people by the end of this century, and we need to prepare for this out-of-control population. And the truth is that that's probably not going to happen. What we show in the book is that when you take a look at fertility statistics in the world and whether or not we're actually producing new people, it's not happening at the rate that it used to, and it's actually declining quite rapidly. So what we really have to get our arms around and our minds around is this idea that the global population is going to peak mid-century and then going to start to decline, and that the structure of that population is going to be much older than the population that we have today. So when we start talking about great power issues, and for example, one of my favorite topics, and something that's going to be on the table here very much during our conversation, you've mentioned it, is the rise of China. Well, except we haven't mentioned what China is really dealing with, which is a rapidly aging population, probably going to tip over into a situation in which it's going to start shrinking around 2030, and how far down we don't even know. The UN's predicting they're going to lose 300 million people this century, which is a country the same size as the United States. The median age of China today is a year older than it is in the United States. It's an old population that's getting rapidly older, and they're getting old and shrinking before they're rich enough to be able to deal with a population like that. So yes, we can talk about great power, issues that are taking place, but it's within the borders of China that the real challenges are going to be emerging.
Well, and it's a challenge for the United States as well, right? I mean, the United States used to pride itself on we're younger, we're dynamic, there's a lot of immigration that refreshes the population, whereas now actually the United States is also coping with an aging population, which is causing, which I thought was really an awesome part of the book. Well, all the real estate prices are going up because old people aren't moving out of those houses anymore.
Right. Most of the world's population growth today is not from new people coming into the population. It's from old people hanging around for longer. So it's actually a remarkable success story. I mean, we've done such a great job at keeping human beings alive around the world that this natural transition that you normally expect isn't happening with either the speed or at the level that anybody anticipated that was going to be happening. So in the United States, back in the mid-1920s, the average person lived to their mid-50s. They're now living till their early 80s, and that whatever house they have in that great part of, say, Manhattan or downtown Washington or down, the best neighborhoods in California or whatever, well, they're aging in place. They're staying right there. So that's why millennials are among the most frustrated people in most places in the world, because all of those things that they thought they were going to have access to, they're not getting them as fast as they thought they were, and they're costing way more than they ever thought they would cost.
And also fodder for revolution, right? I mean, these are people who are connected, who are smart, who are dynamic, interdisciplinary, and they want change.
Yeah, the chance for intergenerational conflict in the world is huge, but also the fact that the world's population is aging is going to change how some of this conflict takes place. Old people don't fight wars, generally. It's a young person's game. China, the median age now is 39. We could have a geriatric peace coming forward in which all of these populations are actually too old, mostly too old to put any soldiers into the field. So we're going to be moving to a new type of, I think, international kind of conversation, merely based on demographic change.
There'll be the Barcalounger Wars.
Well, yeah, well, we'll have to do that, or maybe we'll fight over shuffleboard or something like that. But the interesting thing for me is when I come to this conference, and I've been coming for 10 years, I think I've seen one dinner on it. I mean, nobody talks about this issue, and it is the single biggest trend that's going to affect world politics through the course of this century.
Darrell Bricker of Ipsos, the CEO. Darrell, it's always a pleasure. Really, some of the most thoughtful conversations I've had, and there have been many here. Some of the most interesting ones have been with you. Really appreciate you taking time to join us, and look forward to having you on the podcast again to talk about these issues, because I think they're critically important. Because and thanks to you, every single time somebody says that 11 billion, whether I'm in my bathrobe making coffee in the kitchen, I'm like, that's wrong. So
just wrong.
Yeah, that's right. Thanks so much for joining us.
My pleasure, Vago. Thank you very much.